We're the sky people, the top, they call it in Pleiades. They say we came from the Pleiades, the Omaha people. 30 years ago, I went out and prayed. After being sober for 6 years, I didn't know what I was about. So I asked God to help guide my footsteps, and what I say, and how I say it, and what I do, and where I go, and all of that. So every day I ask God, help guide me, in my walk of life. That path took me to a place in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas. There's a other place over there, Leavenworth Penitentiary, where my relative Leonard Peltier was staying. I didn't really know anything about anything at that time, but through the sweat lodge and through these ceremonies that our people hold, the original instructions they call them, I found my way carrying a pipe and doing for the people. I gave up food and water for 4 days and 4 nights for this direction. These words, Native Youth Alliance, came to my mind at that time, that people coming together, aligning themselves for a common good. And for me, it was the youth, the next generations coming. Because at that time, I felt like I had done so much harm that I was irredeemable. Mr. Leonard Peltier, he felt that I was okay. He asked me to carry his pipe, his sacred pipe, from the penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, back in 1985 to Big Mountain Sundance in Arizona, the resistors out there. So we took his pipe out there and his daughter danced with it. And ever since that day, I've been praying every day for Leonard Peltier's release. We're looking for clemency for him. The song I want to sing today is Leonard Peltier's song. I learned it over at Fort McDowell when they were trying to take their land, and we took a hold of a sacred space and we held it. The FBI's were there. And they were gonna get us. My brother, Crow Dog, he came there at the medicine, set up teepee. We set up all night, prayed for the peoples, that the FBI's would go away. The morning came, and they were gone. So we have celebrations, Fort McDowell's, for that victory. It was there I met some of Leonard Peltier's people, and that's where I learned this song, the Leonard Peltier song. So we're planning a clemency campaign for Leonard Peltier. If you could, maybe call the current president, and maybe somehow he could grant him clemency. To be brave, be courageous, He's our leader and he should do that. What we're doing here today and this weekend, looking at this nation, for the atrocities it's done. But yet they don't want us to remember those things. My Omaha people, we were taken down to 700 individuals about 200 years ago. We're about 10,000 now. But I'm a survivor of genocide. This song's for Leonard. Thank you.
Hear it again for Nathan Phillips.
This drum is called Red Buffalo.
Good morning. My name is Matt Meyer again. I'm one of the coordinating committee members here of this and a special advisor to the independent panel of jurists. It's a great honor now for me, in some ways as the clerk, to introduce the panel of jurists and say just a little word or two about them. Then you will hear from two of them, and the tribunal proceedings will officially be opened. As I think you see in your programs, and I won't necessarily repeat things that you can read for yourselves in the programs, and those of you who are watching via live stream, there is a virtual program that has been published also last night. And if you don't know how to get it or haven't seen it, however you got into the live stream, send an email message or chat and say you need the link to the virtual program, and we'll get that to you as well. The panel of jurists is made up of 9 esteemed international colleagues, friends, but also distinguished advocates, some professional legal advocates and judges, lawyers, some human rights specialists, some leaders of business and religious institutions. And they are before you here, seated at the table, because the idea for the 2 days is that they'll be taking lots of notes. Now, you may be taking notes as well, but because it's their professional job to take notes, they get a table. We have 3 photographs over here, which I think you won't be able to see on the live stream because it's a little complicated to wave the cameras all around. But one of those 3 you'll see on a video shortly, and the other 2 you'll see in videos later in the weekend. But because the coalition that pulled this together is in the spirit of Mandela, and for some other important reasons, we've named our chief jurist a South African, Chief Magdalene Moonsamy. Now, I'm one of those people who, despite your titles, calls everyone by their first names. So excuse me if I say Maggie is a strong advocate who is a judge admitted to the High Court in South Africa. She's also a former member of Parliament of South Africa. And as you'll see when we play the clip, she has a very special message, because we're not just in the spirit of Mandela, we actually have the legacy, the children, we have the Mandela family and the South African government with us here today. I'm going to now, and that's Maggie, and that clip will play in a few moments when I finish introducing the judges. It makes sense to us that the deputy chief, who is with us in the room, is both also a distinguished lawyer and a longtime member and leader of the Puerto Rican Bar Association, and many others. Again, I promised I wouldn't just say what's written in there. But we also think I'll say, given some of what we discussed last night, that it seems appropriate to have a Puerto Rican sitting in judgment of the US rather than vice versa. And I'll ask you to hold your applause until all of them, but help me in welcoming Wilma, Reveron, Collazo, Deputy Chief Judge. We also have, okay, yes, don't hold the applause, just go ahead, applaud for all of them. I'll now just go in the order that they're sitting next to her. From Eritrea and the US, noted academic, and really one of those academics who you can't tell if he's an activist or an academic because he straddles all the worlds. He's also perhaps the most extraordinary businessman I've ever met. Years ago, at some special affair honoring him, we talked about not knowing how he could produce literally thousands of books that get read widely on 3 continents with like $4 or I don't know. It's like, I don't know what he uses for money. It's some magic. But the founder and chief executive officer of Africa World Press and Red Sea Press, Professor Kasahun Chekol. Okay, if you're going to applaud for each of them, you have to applaud in a more rowdy way. Remember, we have people all around watching live stream. We want to hear some applaud. Wilma, Reveron, Collazo, Kasahun Chekol. Much better. Now you have to keep that up for the others, of course. Sitting next to him, now I'm going to get this a little bit wrong because I always jumble the names. It's the World Indigenous, oh, it's so bad. See, I told you, I knew. And also she's going to be a little bit like, but I'm going to get her name right. An esteemed scholar who also is more than that, an activist for her peoples and for all peoples. We could say she's from India, which has a certain truth to it, but really she's one of the colonized people of India. She's from Manipur and a leader not only of the people of Manipur, but a founder of global indigenous organizations. And also literally flown in from Spain, which is not where she's from, but she's a board member of the 1910 Nobel Peace Prize winning organization, the International Peace Bureau, which is not only the oldest and largest consortium of peace organizations, but the most Nobel Peace Prize winning. I don't know how one even says that in English, but the most Nobel Peace Prize winning organizations. They've had no fewer than 12 Nobel Peace Prize laureates that were on their board or amongst their founders, and they themselves, as an organization, won the Peace Prize. When I put Nobel Peace Prize, and then the year they won it, 1910, after her name, they were like, wow, she's 120. No, she's the organization she represents won the prize in 1910. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Bina Nepram. We did try carefully in creating an independent panel of jurors to not have too many people from the US because of the international flavor and need for an international context for the event. But there's one organization, the US Human Rights Network, that has historically, for the last 15 years, although much of this work predates that by many, many decades, played some leading roles. And part of one of the major reasons for that leadership has to do with the next speaker, who also is a past president, the next jurist, sorry, who also is a leader, a past president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and who is an advocate, but not always in a legal sense, so she has tremendous legal acumen, but in the freedom-fighting sense. Dr. Vicky, I say Victoria, Dr. Vicky Casanova Willis. A leader of the Muslim Peace Fellowship, a leader of local immigrant rights groups connected to immigrants from throughout the Caribbean, but also her native Haiti, and the United Nations representative of the oldest interfaith peace organization on the planet, the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. Please help me welcome Representative Shirley Fabre. And finally, our last in-person, another person from the US, but who we felt we could not do without. Not only a distinguished anthropologist and professor, the author of an important paper that caught many of our attentions in the International Peace Research Association and throughout the US, a paper on why the US needs a truth commission on white supremacy. This man is also one of the global leaders in the fight against genocide, his history in working on international tribunals for the prevention of genocide and examining the genocide, especially in Cambodia, Kampuchea, and a UNESCO-affiliated genocide expert. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Alex Hinton. And finally, I'll pause. And while I'm pausing, can we give a round of applause? And I'll let them sign this as well, because this pause should be for a round of applause for our American Sign Language interpreters. And so finally, it's worth in saying the other two of the 9 who are not here, that 2 of them, Maggie Moonsamy, who I introduced, and Professor Mireille Fanon Mendes from France, are not here because essentially it was not clear that they would be allowed in. And we'll say more about that later, but there's been a lot of work in the last 2 weeks, and Dr. Casanova-Willis has been at the forefront of that work, to have them come in and be able to represent themselves and their organizations and their community. And that seemed like that was not going to happen. So the 8th jurist, Professor Mireille Fanon Mendes France, I believe she's live streaming and listening to us, so we want to have her really here from the Zoom or from the live stream, our applause and our appreciation. And to be perfectly honest, the last of the 9 jurists is not here for a different reason, less nefarious and more positive. Chairman Brian Wheaton is the youngest elected leader of his people, the Mashpee Wampanoag. And in his 24 young years, he's not only become a leader of the Mashpee Wampanoag, he's also been a leader. I met him amongst mutual friends in Aquinnah, of the Wampanoag Aquinnah, and he's a national representative of the group Unity, which is United Native American Youth, and many other international youth endeavors amongst indigenous peoples. He's not here today, and he sends his regrets, and you'll see videos of these later in the weekend, all of these. He's not here because, depending on how long I've spoken for, it's possible he's now, for the first time, a father. But he's literally an expectant father any minute now, and we said, it's okay, you can Zoom in, you can live stream with us, but please stay by your bride, and good luck with your impending fatherhood. So with that, let's give all of the 9 jurists our appreciation and a round of incredible applause.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I am Magdalene Moonsamy, the Chief Judge, presiding over the United Nations Tribunal in the spirit and legacy of the Russell Courts on Vietnam from 1966 to 1967 and Latin America 1973 to 1976, and the Permanent People's Tribunal, which followed from 1979 to present, which takes us back a couple of decades. A newly constituted panel of jurists from the fields of law and human rights has assembled to oversee the International Tribunal on U.S. human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, to take place from the 22nd to the 25th of October 2021 as experts in the interrelated fields of institutional and structural racism, colonialism and neocolonialism, women's and children's rights, minorities' rights, Indigenous treaties and international law, self-determination and sovereignty processes, and the Genocide Conventions. The panel of jurists asserts itself as an independent and non-governmental body, which will convene to hear the testimony based on a broad indictment served to the accused United States federal and state parties. The International Tribunal itself derives from a historical legacy and trajectory initiated by the United States-based coalition in the spirit of Mandela, created in 2018, the coalition recognized and reaffirms the rich history of diverse activists, including Nelson Mandela, Winnie Mandela, Graça Machel, Ella Baker, Dennis Banks, Cesar Chavez, Fanny Luhama, Fred Korematsu, Lolita Lebron, Rosa Parks, Ingrid Washina-Watok, and many more in the resistance traditions of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Though fully independent and separate from the spirit of the Mandela Coalition, the panel of jurists recognizes the important experiences which have shaped the petitioner's charges against the United States government agencies. The current global geopolitics has confirmed that really we are a planet and we are a world at war, despite the pandemic and despite the other challenges we face. We remain with challenges that continue to affirm that there is oppression that continues. I wish to read to you now a message of endorsement from a daughter of Nelson Mandela and Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Her Royal Highness, Princess Zenani Dlamini. And I will read it verbatim as the message has been supporting the tribunal. Message of endorsement for the International Tribunal on U.S. human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. I am honored to give my endorsement to this important initiative at a time when global intolerance and prejudice is on the rise, which has not only been exacerbated by COVID-19, but COVID-19 has also shone the spotlight on global systemic prejudice and inequality. Through the initiative, which I hope will compel world leaders to show political will to act on these injustices perpetrated against the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, which my mom and dad, Winnie Madikizela and Nelson Mandela, fought tirelessly and selflessly to eradicate. In addressing these issues, which have now become more than ever pervasive in our society, the actions of the International Tribunal will not only bring to the fore the plight of the world's disenfranchised, marginalized, and poor, but in the process will continue to champion the very causes that were very important to my parents and other struggle activists. As a child of political activists who suffered not only from my parents' incarceration, but also from the pain and trauma of being separated from them, I understand the sacrifices and meaning of what it takes to stand up to social injustice and speak truth to power. As such, I am committed to the principles and ideals of restorative justice and the inalienable rights for all. My family and I are committed to a world free of prejudice, social and gender injustices, where all human rights for all are respected, acknowledged, and applied, always in solidarity. Her Royal Highness, Princess Zenani Dlamini, dated the 16th of October, 2021.
Good morning, everyone. I welcome you to this first session of the International Tribunal on United States Human Rights Abuses. And in commemoration of the first genocide accusation, can we call it? Yeah. And the first genocide accusation that was brought up before the international community by none other than Paul Robeson. We are here gathered today in a place that is a holy place. It is a holy place because we are here sharing this space where our brother and leader Malcolm X gave his last breath. So his spirit is here with us. It is very important that we maintain the sacredness and the respect that we owe our forefathers and our leaders that gave everything they had, including their life, to continue the struggle for justice. Why an international tribunal? And I must say, an international people's tribunal. Because the tribunals that the system, that the capitalist system can provide, the justice that the capitalist system can provide, is not really oriented and does not have the objective of giving true justice to the peoples. The legal system in a capitalist society, in a capitalist state, is to maintain the institutions of the system, to provide certain facade of justice, to sell the image of democracy within a system that by its definition cannot provide true justice to the people. So we have to create our own institutions so the people that have been harmed, that have been abused, that have been discriminated against, can really have their voice truly and sincerely heard. And we surely hope that the outcome of this tribunal, after what I am anticipating, will be a very emotional and a very sincere voicing of all the abuses that our Black, Indigenous, and brown people have suffered at the hands of the government of the United States and at the hands of this government of the states of the United States, can really be heard and can be really be explained, can really be reproduced, and can really be spread as wide as possible throughout the world. Because as our leader, Puerto Rican independence nationalist leader, Pedro Albizu Campo, once mentioned, we may not have the armies or the naval fleets to destroy and to fight against the empire of the United States, but we do have the moral righteousness, the dignity, and we can make the world see who they really are, and we can really destroy their morality before the world. So this tribunal is gonna hear the voices that we started hearing last night. One of those voices said that we were in fact in a civil war, that we were in fact in a war against fascism. And that is an echo of what our brother Fred Hampton was said. He said, nothing is more important than stopping fascism, because fascism will stop us all. So this coalition building, which this tribunal hopes to be an important instrument of, has the objective of, once we garner the information and we garner the hearts of all who are going to stand here to let us hear their specific story, we can really united push forward in our fight for justice and freedom. We cannot forget that the United States was created over the bones of our Black people who were enslaved, over the bones of our Native American people who were massacred and were thrown out of the land. We cannot forget that slavery and colonialism are institutions of imperialism. So in fighting for all our causes for justice and freedom, we are fighting against the original sin, if we want to call it one way. We're fighting against imperialism. We are fighting against fascism. We are fighting against colonialism. And we are fighting against neocolonialism and the new kinds of enslavement that these institutions impose over the vast majority of the people in the earth. I want to close my words with some words from Ella Baker. The major job was getting people to understand that they could have something within their power that they could use, and it could only be used if they understood what was happening and how group action could counter violence. And hopefully that's what we're going to achieve with the work that we're starting today. Thank you very much and welcome again.
May it please this honorable and historic tribunal, esteemed members of this international panel of jurists, Black and brown indigenous people residing in the United States, allies, and the world at large. My name is Nkechi Taifa, and I'm serving as Chief People's Counsel for this auspicious proceeding, which is charging the United States government with violations of international human rights. The plaintiff class, which I represent, consists of Black, brown, and indigenous people comprising the following racial and national groups. Number one, people of African descent brought to the United States by 400 years of chattel enslavement or by immigration from former slave territories, often as a result of additional economic oppression brought upon them post-enslavement by defendant U.S. government and co-conspirator former colonial powers following the independence of their lands of their birth. Number two, people of Latinx descent, both natives of territories taken or acquired by the expanding United States, and those who migrated to United States territory, often as a result of further economic oppression brought upon them by the defendant U.S. government and the former colonial powers following their independence. And number three, First Nation peoples, original to the lands now occupied by defendant United States, mostly taken by force and or breach of genuine and fraudulent treaties with indigenous nations and or interlopers. The defendant class consists of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of all levels of United States government, as well as state, county, and local political subdivisions. Thus, on behalf of the plaintiffs, the Black, brown, and indigenous people residing in the United States, I present the following opening statement. In 1903, upon the launch of his seminal treatise, The Souls of Black Folk, historian W.E.B. Du Bois prophesied that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line, referring to the pernicious role of race in U.S. society. And now, more than 100 years later, his prognosis is even more ominous, as the evidence from this tribunal will show that conditions facing Black, brown, and indigenous peoples residing in the United States during the 21st century amount to genocide. This charge is not the ranting and raving of wild-eyed militancy, but as you will see from testimony and exhibits during this tribunal, results from a careful and methodical analysis of over 400 years of examination and study. This tribunal is, however, by far not the first such inquiry. It comes on the heels of the January to February 2021 International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Political Police Violence Against People of African Descent in the United States. The 1992 International Tribunal of Indigenous Peoples and Oppressed Nations from San Francisco. The 1990 International Tribunal on the Human Rights Violations of Political Prisoners and Prisoners of War in the United States, New York. The 1979 International Jurists report to the UN Human Rights Commission on visit with human rights petitioners in the United States. This tribunal stands on the shoulders of El-Hajj, Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, whose models were land, self-determination, self-defense, and internationalization. And it is in this very sacred space, this building, formerly known as the Audubon Ballroom, where his DNA still manifests as we gather to continue. As we gather to continue to honor his sacrifice and carry on the tradition of his work. And then last, but most major, this October 2021 tribunal stands on the shoulders of the seminal 1951 Civil Rights Congress petition to the UN, "We Charge Genocide, the crime of government against the Negro people," 20 years later published as "We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people." So this tribunal today, while not unique, seeks to once again unabatedly and unabashedly charge genocide. But this time, rather than a sole reliance on the international treaty, the Convention to Prevent and Punish the Crime of Genocide, the only vehicle available when the original 1951 petition was brought to the UN, today we also seek jurisdiction based on the implementation of that international treaty as documented within the United States Code. Although this tribunal seeks to use the international definition of genocide as a lens to scrutinize 5 key issue areas: policing, mass incarceration, political prisoners, environmental racism, and public health system inequities, and their impact on Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, the genocidal impact in other systems such as education and the racial wealth gap, etc., could likewise be so examined. I would be remiss if I did not, unfortunately, acknowledge that the term genocide appears to singularly conjure in most minds images of fiery ovens and atrocious massacres. And as such, there is often a blanket denunciation of the applicability of that term to the United States. This censure, while understandable from the colonizer's standpoint, is myopic from the viewpoint of the colonized. Seldom does the colonizer class dispassionately examine the internationally accepted parameters of the term genocide and then methodically apply that definition to the impact of United States policies and practices on particular racial groups, or if one were to do so, and this tribunal attempts to do such, we hope that you will agree that the definition of genocide against a substantial segment of the Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in the United States is a reality. The evidence that you will hear and review will specifically and unabashedly address the issue of genocide with both testimony and documentary evidence. In this tribunal, we will present the definition of genocide embraced by the international community and analyze its adoption as ratified by the United States. We will tackle a presumptively fundamental barrier, the issue of intent, and discuss how that hurdle just might be overcome. This tribunal will demonstrate far-reaching and grave implications which in many respects parallel the definition of genocide against substantial segments of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities within the framework of both international law as well as domestic law. Because the issue is so major, and because of the limited white ethnocentric nature of the educational system in the United States, permit me for a moment to delve a little deeper into this background and history. You will hear in either testimony or documentary evidence that the UN General Assembly in 1948 adopted the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. You will hear that the convention confirmed that genocide, whether committed in a time of peace or in a time of war, is a crime under international law, which the contracting parties undertake to prevent and to punish. Genocide, the convention declares, is the committing of certain acts with, quote, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, religious group. You will learn that according to the International Convention, the following acts constitute genocide. Number 1, killing members of the group. Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Number 3, inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part. Number 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Number 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. You will hear that pursuant to the Genocide Convention, however, genocide is not the only actionable act. Related acts such as conspiracy to commit genocide, directing public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in its commission. Furthermore, the international definition concludes by reminding the parties that those who commit genocide or any of the other related acts, quote, shall be punished, regardless of whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. Now, the UN General Assembly adopted the Genocide Convention in 1948 without dissent, with the United States being the first nation to sign. Indeed, the US delegation played a pivotal role in drafting the International Convention. However, it took the United States 48 long years, 38 years to give its advice and consent to ratification. And one of the articulated reasons for this unconscionable delay was the fear that Black folk in the United States would use the treaty to their advantage. That fear was not without substance. Why? Because in 1951, 3 years after the passage of the Genocide Convention by the United Nations, W.B. Du Bois, William Patterson, Mary Church Terrell, Paul Robeson, and over 90 others presented the United Nations with that historic petition, chronicling the genocidal sufferings, murder, mental assault, and crimes against humanity inflicted against Black people. So what were the reasons for the delay? The documentary evidence you will review will reveal that it included the anxieties of segregationists, that ratification would subject the United States to punishment under the convention based on this country's treatment of Native and Black people. According to an American Bar Association scholar whose committee chronicled the history of the Genocide Convention's ratification process, the Genocide Convention set a record as the most scrutinized and analyzed non-military treaty ever to be considered by the United States Senate. Indeed, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held hearings for 13 days. More than 200 witnesses representing divergent views testified. The hearings transcript was more than 2,000 pages long. So nearly 40 years after its adoption by the United Nations, and after scores of other nations had finally ratified it, the US Senate finally gave its consent and advice to ratification, subject to the enactment of what is called implementing legislation under federal law. And you know, implementing legislation was now critical because the Genocide Convention, distinct from later international human rights treaties, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Genocide Convention incorporated a provision that the contracting parties agree to enact the necessary legislation in their respective jurisdictions prior to depositing the ratification documents with the United Nations. This provision was significant in that it ensured that ratification of the Genocide Convention would not be a symbolic gesture, but would have the full force of laws and the authority to enact penalties. April 4th, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Genocide Convention Implementation Act, ratifying the International Genocide Convention in U.S. law. The only treaty that is self-implementing, okay? It doesn't need it. It already came with the implementation. I think they learned from that experience. So all the other ones after that, they sought to limit its application. But the Genocide Convention, it is there. Of course, they did make a couple of changes to limit, in an attempt to limit its applicability. These changes including adding the term specific instead of intent, and substantial instead of part, and defining mental harm as the permanent impairment of mental faculties, particularly referring to the application of narcotic drugs. Thus, the Genocide Convention, as codified in U.S. law, Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1091, reads as following, quote, whoever, whether in time of peace or in time of war, in a circumstance described in subsection D, and with the specific intent to destroy in whole or in substantial part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, again, 1, kills members of the group. 2, causes serious bodily injury to members of the group. 3, causes the permanent impairment of the mental faculties of members of the group through drugs, torture, or similar techniques. 4, subjects the group to conditions of life that are intended to cause the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. Imposing measures to prevent births within the group or transfers by force children of the group to another group shall be punished. So jurors, I found it important to just go over this bit of procedural history as part of this tribunal's opening framing, because it is not the history that's normally taught in schools in general, or even law schools. And in fact, the very fact of United States codification has essentially remained hidden from the general public. Esteemed jurors, much of what you will hear during this tribunal arises from institutional and structural racism, in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representation, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial and ethnic group inequity. And as such, the quote specific intent prong as inserted by the United States admittedly could be a fundamental hurdle to use of this treaty as codified by the United States law. Indeed, I will submit it is a difficult hurdle, given the restrictive manner in which U.S. courts have historically construed the intent requirement within a general equal protection analysis. Jurors, as you listen to the testimony during this weekend's tribunal and review the documentary exhibits, ask yourself, are these concerns, are these conscious acts intended to cause destruction? Are they the unconscious effects of structural racism, or do they in fact constitute genocide? During this tribunal, you will learn that the United States inflicts police racism and violence against Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. You will both hear and review through witness-hearing evidence that the United States systemically executes Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities through the unchecked practices of police brutality, the manufacturing of hypercriminalization, and the perpetration of slow death conditions. Indeed, racially biased and extrajudicial killings against Black people, whether by lynch mobs or officers of the law, fall within the definitional prongs of the Genocide Convention. You will learn that the United States perpetrates a criminal legal system that results in a mass incarceration unparalleled in the world. You will hear testimony that the United States has refused to acknowledge and subsequently address clear evidence of systemic racial bias while systematically criminalizing poverty to the specific detriment of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. You will also learn that the oppression and struggle against oppression in the United States has resulted in a class of political prisoners and prisoners of war peculiar to the historic, ongoing, and now normalized reality of colonialism and genocide in the United States imposed upon Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, which started with the incursion and occupation of the Americas by white settlers from Europe in 1619 and continues structurally and systematically to this present day. I will direct your attention specifically to Appendix A, detailing cases of political prisoners in the United States. You will hear the definition of political prisoners as defined by the then 1990 Special International Tribunal on the violation of human rights of political prisoners and prisoners of war in the United States prisons and jails. You will hear testimony about the COINTELPRO, how the U.S. government's once secret illegal campaign seeking to disrupt and destroy movements in general and those led by Black, brown, and indigenous populations in particular was manifest. You will hear comparisons that U.S. political prisoners who fought against United States apartheid are no different than the late President Nelson Mandela, who headed South Africa's African National Congress and eventually was forced to lead armed struggle against the sustained and the systemic violence, racial violence, abuse, and oppression of South African apartheid. The US CIA played a significant role in Mandela's 1962 capture and put him on their terrorist list. Mandela served nearly 27 years in prison. This tribunal would like you to take special note that many of the political prisoners you will either hear about during this tribunal, as well as those testimonies incorporated in the appendix, have served well over 40 years behind bars. You will hear that they have been subjected to lengthy sentences as a result of their politics, beliefs, and conscious actions against their oppression. And many, after having served their court-ordered time, have been repeatedly denied parole. How they have experienced torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment and punishment, many serving decades in solitary confinement, suffering from medical conditions and neglect, all causing serious bodily and mental harm, all in contravention to international human rights in general and the Genocide Convention in particular. You will hear that in more recent years, more political prisoners, largely supporters of modern day movements such as climate action, Black Lives Matter, and other movements, are being illegally surveilled and detained by the government under pretext of rooting out extremist groups disproportionately composed of people who publicly challenge the dehumanization and oppression of communities of color. You will learn that the United States intentionally inflicts bodily harm on Black, brown, and indigenous people through environmental racism. Specifically, you will hear witness testimony that the United States knowingly created and negligently ignored the Flint water crisis, failed to produce and enforce environmental regulations in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, and deliberately inflicted conditions of life that will bring about physical destruction in the face of natural disasters. Finally, you will learn that the United States has created a health crisis that aids in the destruction in whole or in part of Black, brown, and indigenous communities, creating conditions of genocide through the promulgation of an environment that results in inequitable health conditions that disproportionately and deliberately impact members of the plaintiff class. Through these conditions, the United States has created a mental health crisis, increased infant and mortality rates, and increased rates of disease and death. You will hear testimony that the United States has created the mental health crisis through historically oppressive systems, facilitated an inaccessible healthcare system, resulting in disproportionate health issues in the Black community, and constructed harmful living spaces that triggers disease, delays in biological developments, and often death, and has done so intentionally. And the United States has imposed measures meant to prevent births to Black, brown, and indigenous peoples held in detention and coerce those facing charges into sterilization. And finally, the US has intentionally and forcibly transferred the children of Black incarcerated parents and brown immigrants as part of policy. Esteemed jurists, in closing, you have before you an awesome responsibility and a courageous task. Just as in 1955, when Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, demanded an open casket for the world to see the image of her 14-year-old son, Emmett, savagely mutilated and dumped in Mississippi's Tallahatchie River, the duty of this tribunal is to likewise present an open casket for the world to see and hear the testimonies of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who have been subjected to human rights abuses. Open it up, Mamie Till demanded. Let the world see what they did to my boy, she demanded, as her son's mangled and battered body was thrust into public view. And indeed, her decision forced the nation and the world to face in shocked disbelief the horror of racism. This tribunal will likewise open up the voluminous body of evidence for the world to see, and hopefully, with your verdict, begin the process to hold those responsible accountable. As Dr. Martin Luther King once stated, the ultimate test of a person is not where she stands in moments of comfort, in moments of convenience, but where she stands in moments of challenge and moments of controversy. Yes, it may be challenging to the United States that we are using not only an international human rights frame to which to present domestic harms, but quite intentionally a genocide frame. It may be controversial for some to hear that mere whispers that crimes against humanity were perpetrated domestically, or that the plaintiffs in this tribunal still charge genocide. But these are not comfortable or convenient times. Just as Mamie Till commanded in 1955, there is a time when we must open up that casket. There is a time when we must right the wrongs. It is once again time for the world to see and to act. The time is now. Moments of crisis also represent moments of opportunity. I humbly ask that this set of international jurists before us today, that you listen to all of the evidence, both testamentary as well as documentary, and return a verdict for justice rooted in international human rights law. Thank you very much.